student journalism's role in shaping history.
So what our objectives are for today is we're going to be going over the importance of journalism, more specifically the importance of student journalism throughout history and throughout the present. And after we're done with that, we're going to be going over how Mankler falls into that category and how we were able to be a voice advocacy for the student population here in Texas Wesleyan.
And before we dive deep into that, I think it's important to establish what exactly journalism's role is in society. Firstly, journalism sets narratives. It gives us the words, the facts, the figures to describe our collective realities and ultimately act upon it. Journalists act as watchdogs. The people in power have all sorts of methods to surveil citizenry, and journalism is a method of the citizens to do it back at the government. Similar to that, it gives a voice to the voiceless. Journalism is very important to platforming those who otherwise are marginalized and don't necessarily have the voice to voice their concerns and the grievances that journalism incentivizes action. By giving people the words and the narratives and the facts and the figures to truly describe their realities, they give them the impetus to act upon those realities and make a difference. And student journalism in particular is occupies a very specific place. Throughout history, college campuses have always been a bedrock and a hotbed for activism of all types. Any sort of popular movement you can point to most likely started in some way on a college campus. And this revolutionary spirit absolutely extends to student journalism. We'll start with our first case study, student journalism and how it affected the civil rights movement. So overall, college newspapers, like I said, occupy a very particular place in the realm of media and journalism. Because they don't necessarily occupy the mainstream, they're able to actually challenge mainstream media narratives which are otherwise compromised by corporate interests, money-making, and other sullying factors. In the civil rights movement, student journalism was able to cover campus protests and organization from a perspective that was the most accurate and without any sorts of corruption, I would say. And through this, student journalism was able to mobilize wider movements throughout college campuses, which were actually a very, very big part of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. One very, 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 very key party in the civil rights movement was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCCC, which organized a variety of protests and sit-ins and general nonviolent activism against segregation, discrimination, and other things that befall the colored people at the time. So probably the biggest thing that they're famous for, and that they're not necessarily given the credit for, are the freedom rides, which were actually created and initiated by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee alongside the Congress of Racial Equality, which is another student activism group. And the freedom rides just involved black and white people riding desegregated buses together in the wake of desegregation to truly challenge the enforcement of the new laws and make sure that whole government's accountable for the civil rights acts that were signed. Obviously, that was met with lots and lots of violence in the face of their nonviolence. But particularly, the SNCC was also a venture for student journalism. The SNCC's primary method of organization and mobilization was their newspaper and their newsletter, The Student Voice, which was used to spread their movement across the country to campuses throughout the entire United States. Moving from the civil rights movement into around the same period, the Vietnam War, Students for a Democratic Society was actually an organization that was very, very, very influenced by the civil rights movement and the student organizers of that time. It began in 1960 at the University of Michigan, of course, spread across the nation. It was one of the biggest ever national student activist groups in American history and led plenty of anti-war protests against American involvement in the Vietnam War. And as we all know, student protests were possibly the biggest factor in ending the Vietnam War. Particularly, they were also a vector of student journalism through their newsletter, the SDS News, which organized students across the country to engage in anti-war protests, sit-ins, and other violent and non-violent demonstrations against the government's involvement in Vietnam.
So that leads us into the Harvard Crimson and their coverage of the Pentagon Papers. So really quick, the Pentagon Papers were a group of essays, notes, letters that were leaked by one Daniel Ellsberg, who is considered to be one of the most prominent figures in the Vietnam War. He's probably one of the main voices who shifted American opinion on how the U.S. Army was conducting their experiments in Vietnam. So what the Harvard Crimson did, which is a student publication, they wrote a critical review on Senator J. Unger's review on how the media was receiving the Pentagon Papers and Ellsberg's letters. He basically compared and contrasted the two. It was published on September 18, 1972. And the papers, Ellsberg's papers on the war argued the government's that chose to limit escalation to avoid losing Vietnam before election time. So basically, they didn't want to lose Vietnam to avoid election results. What this paper did, though, is it basically demonstrated that news publications could think critically in the time of war, because a lot of news publications during that time, they were very very emotional, very vocal about America's stance on the Vietnam War and sending troops over there. And so while this article didn't necessarily bring send the troops home immediately, but it did shift America's opinions on how America was doing operations in Vietnam.
And so these were a few case studies from the past, but it's very, very important to recognize that student journalism is still shaping history and shaping our present day. And really, under this administration, journalism has been under attack in plenty of ways. It's been fettered, and the founding fathers realized that journalism was the bedrock of any sort of democratic society, so much so that they made the very, very first amendment to the Constitution, being the free press, free speech, freedom of assembly, and all these things. And student journalism is particularly vulnerable. Journalism as a whole is under attack, but student journalism, as I said, occupies a very specific space in the industry, and because of that is particularly vulnerable as they're tied to things such as grants, federal funding, and other things that fund universities, which obviously, as a whole, have been leveraged against universities and students who don't necessarily demonstrate speech that the administration is particularly fond of. A good example is recently a Tufts University graduate student was detained and abducted by ICE for pro-Palestinian speech that she published in her own newspaper. So it's very, very important, particularly for student journalism, to be protected due to its vulnerability. And that leads us to what we do at the Rambler. While we're not necessarily ending any wars yet, I still think that we have been doing some very, very important work, particularly when it comes to our little community here at Texas Wesleyan, this little nook of Fort Worth. There are just some interesting recent articles that we've written that maybe have to do with the shaping of our current present, again, in this little community that we have here.
So that leads us to how we cover, or how student journalism covers news deserts. So really quick, what is a news desert? A news desert is a town or region that is void of any news publication. So for example, let's say, the police are called for a domestic violence case. Well, in a news desert, who's going to